What if the loudest sound in the room wasn't applause, but a collective refusal? That's the question hanging over a cold January night in Utah. The kind of question that makes publicists tense and celebrities suddenly aware of how thin the line is between admiration and rejection. Because this was supposed to be a celebration, a victory lap, a carefully staged moment of validation. Instead, something shifted in the air, and once it did, there was no controlling it. Picture this. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Bright lights bouncing off fresh snow, security moving people along with clipped politeness, a crowd that looks, at first glance, like every other festival crowd, phones out, voices buzzing, that familiar mix of curiosity, excitement, and the low hum of expectation. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. And then something goes wrong. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, no shouting match, no single explosive incident, just a sound, or maybe the absence of the right sound, a pause where applause should be, a murmur that doesn't quite land as supportive, and then, unmistakably, boos, heckling, not universal, not unanimous, but loud enough to register, loud enough to change the temperature of the moment. Here's the uncomfortable truth most celebrity coverage avoids. You don't need everyone to boo for it to matter. You only need enough people in the right place at the wrong time. And that's what made this night different. This wasn't a random red carpet. It wasn't a tabloid ambush or a hostile interviewer. This was a debut appearance tied to a documentary premiere. A moment designed to communicate credibility, relevance, and cultural alignment. The setting mattered. The timing mattered, and the audience, especially this audience, mattered more than anyone anticipated. Ask yourself something honestly. When was the last time you saw a public figure truly lose control of a narrative in real time? Not spin later, not issue statements, not clarify the next morning, but actually lose it in the moment when cameras are rolling and reactions are unfiltered. Because that's what made this incident ripple outwards so quickly. It wasn't just what was heard, it was what couldn't be unseen. Faces tightening, smiles that lingered a second too long, body language shifting in ways no media training can fully disguise. These are the moments audiences pick up on instinctively. You feel them before you analyze them. And once people feel something is off, curiosity takes over. Why is the crowd reacting like this? Why does the energy feel wrong? Why does this moment feel heavier than it should? Those questions spread faster than any official narrative ever could. What's crucial to understand, and what many casual viewers miss, is that this wasn't just about a film, or even about two high-profile figures. This was about expectation colliding with mood, about a story being presented at a time when public patience is thinner than usual. And that matters because the audience didn't come in neutral. They never do. There's a tendency to treat crowds as blank slates waiting to be impressed. That's a mistake. Every audience arrives carrying opinions, fatigue, curiosity, skepticism, and emotional residue from everything they've already seen and heard, especially when the people on stage are already globally familiar. By the time the lights came up and the entrance was made, judgments, fair or unfair, were already in the room, and this raises a bigger, more uncomfortable question. Can you still control your own story once the public decides it's tired of hearing it? That question sits at the heart of this entire incident. Because if this were just a few hecklers, it wouldn't matter. If it were a clearly hostile crowd, it could be dismissed. But this was neither. This was something murkier. Some people cheered, some stayed silent, some booed, some laughed uncomfortably, and some filmed, not because they were fans, but because they sensed something awkward was unfolding and didn't want to miss it. That mixed reaction is the most destabilizing scenario of all. It's harder to spin than pure praise or pure outrage. It suggests uncertainty, fracture, a loss of consensus. And consensus is everything in celebrity culture. Think about it. When people love you, they overlook flaws. When they hate you, they organize against you. But when they're unsure, that's when narratives start to unravel. Because uncertainty invites interpretation. Was this backlash about the documentary's theme? Was it about perceived overexposure? Was it about timing, tone, or trust? Or was it about something deeper, something that's been building quietly for years and finally found an outlet in a room that didn't feel obligated to play along? Here's where the story gets more interesting. The Sundance Film Festival has a reputation that's very different from glossy premieres in Los Angeles or London. This isn't a crowd that claps because it's expected. It's a crowd that prides itself on discernment, on independence, on not being impressed by status alone. That culture creates a dangerous illusion for public figures. It feels welcoming, but it's conditional. You're celebrated here not for who you are, but for what you bring. And if the audience senses a mismatch between message and moment, they don't stay polite about it. That's why this particular reaction hit harder than it might have elsewhere. It wasn't just noise, it was a signal. A signal that something about this presentation didn't land the way it was intended to. And the most revealing part? It didn't seem fully anticipated. There's a difference between bracing for criticism and being genuinely surprised by it. Seasoned performers can usually mask the former. The latter leaks through in micro-expressions, posture, hesitation. Those leaks are what people fixated on afterward. Not just the boos, but the seconds surrounding them. The pause, the recalibration. The way the room never quite settled back into celebration mode. Because once a crowd senses discomfort, it amplifies it. Silence becomes louder. Applause feels performative. Every reaction is scrutinized. And somewhere in that tension, a planned narrative quietly slips out of reach. Now here's where I want to slow down and ask you something directly. If you were standing there, on that stage, under those lights, what would you have felt? Anger? Confusion? Embarrassment? Defiance? Or something worse? The realization that you no longer fully understand how the room sees you? That realization can be devastating because it suggests a gap between intention and impact, between the story you believe you're telling and the one people are actually hearing. And gaps like that don't close easily, especially not in an era where every moment is clipped, shared, debated, and reframed within minutes. Within hours of the appearance, the tone of online conversation began to shift. Not explosively, suddenly, questions replaced praise. Jokes crept in. Commentators hedged their language. Supporters defended. Critics pounced. Neutrals watched and waited. And waiting, in media terms, is never a good sign, because it means the next development matters more than the last one. What made this night especially volatile is that it wasn't meant to be controversial at all. It was positioned as warm, purpose-driven, even celebratory, which made the backlash, however partial, feel sharper by contrast. Expectation magnifies disappointment. That's a rule that applies to films, relationships, careers, and public personas alike. And it leads us to a realization that's uncomfortable but necessary if we're going to understand what really happened here. This wasn't a single moment. It was a collision point, a place where long-simmering public sentiment, a carefully crafted project, and a very specific audience intersected and didn't align. The boos didn't come out of nowhere. They arrived carrying baggage, context, history, and once they landed, they reframed everything that followed, which is why the most important part of this story isn't the noise itself. It's what happened immediately after. The decisions made off stage, the conversations behind closed doors, the strategic silences, the subtle shifts in tone that signaled something had gone wrong, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Because the truth is, public figures can survive criticism. They can even survive ridicule. What's harder to survive is the moment when the audience stops playing its assigned role. And that's exactly what seemed to happen that night. But to understand why this moment unfolded the way it did and why it resonated far beyond a single festival appearance, we have to rewind. We have to look at what Sundance represents, what this crowd expects, and why walking into that space with the wrong assumptions can turn a celebration into a reckoning. Because what came next didn't just reshape the night, it changed the story entirely. And no one in that room saw it coming. What does a comeback look like when everyone assumes the ending before the opening scene even plays? That was the unspoken question hovering over this night long before the first camera flashed. Because to understand why the moment unraveled the way it did, you have to understand what it was supposed to be. Not emotionally, strategically. This was meant to be a reset, a turning point. A night that quietly signaled, without ever saying it out loud, we're back on our own terms now. That intention shaped everything, from the choice of venue to the pacing of the rollout, from the carefully selected festival to the tone of the project itself. Nothing about this appearance was casual, nothing was accidental. And that's precisely why the reaction stung more than anyone expected. Let's rewind. In the weeks leading up to the festival, the mood inside their orbit was reportedly optimistic. Not euphoric, not reckless, but confident. The kind of confidence that comes from believing you've finally found the right frame, the right audience. The right moment to be seen again, not as subjects of controversy, but as creators, storytellers, people with something meaningful to offer. Sundance felt ideal for that. Not flashy, not red carpet loud, prestigious without being elitist. Known for rewarding sincerity over spectacle. The thinking was simple. If you can win here, you don't need to shout anywhere else. And there's a deeper layer to that calculation. Sundance audiences are famously allergic to overt branding. They don't like being sold to. They don't like being told what to feel. But when they sense authenticity, even flawed authenticity, they lean in hard. Careers have been made in those rooms, reputations salvaged, narratives reframed. That's the dream, anyway. The idea was that this debut wouldn't feel like a celebrity appearance. It would feel like a creative milestone, a quiet arrival, not a victory parade, a step into a different kind of spotlight. But here's the contradiction no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. You can't fully shed celebrity gravity just because you wish to, no matter how intimate the project, no matter how earnest the tone. When you walk into a space carrying years of headlines, interviews, debates, and polarized opinion, that baggage walks in with you. It takes a seat, it listens, and it reacts, sometimes louder than the work itself. From the outside, the build-up looked restrained. No excessive hype, no aggressive promotion. Just enough visibility to generate curiosity without triggering fatigue. The messaging emphasized storytelling. Perspective, a desire to contribute something thoughtful to the cultural conversation. And for a moment, it seemed like that approach might work. Early chatter was cautious but open. People were intrigued, not universally supportive, but willing to give the project a chance. That willingness is fragile. It doesn't survive misalignment. What no one can ever fully control is how expectation settles in a room. You can curate press, you can manage optics, you can rehearse lines and anticipate questions. But you can't dictate the emotional weather of an audience that's already formed opinions in the privacy of its own head. And by the time the entrance happened, the emotional weather was unsettled. Some attendees arrived curious but skeptical. Others came ready to be moved. A few came simply because it was the most talked about premiere of the night. And some, whether we like it or not, came hoping for awkwardness, for tension, for something to go wrong. That mix is combustible. Here's something worth pausing on. When people talk about public backlash, they often imagine a single emotion driving it: anger, jealousy, resentment. But real backlash is usually messier. It's boredom colliding with frustration, fatigue mixing with fascination. A sense of, we've heard this before, rubbing up against what if this time is different. That internal contradiction plays out in behavior. You clap, but you hesitate. You smile, but you watch closely. You laugh, but you wonder if you should. And when someone in that crowd breaks the tension, when a boo cuts through the uncertainty, it gives permission to everyone else's doubt. That's how moments tip. The confidence going into the night wasn't fake. It was earned, at least from their perspective. They believed this project represented growth. Distance from past narratives, a pivot towards something more grounded, more constructive. But belief isn't the same as consensus. And consensus is what they needed that night. Because without it, every reaction becomes magnified. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every sound becomes symbolic. The intention had been to let the work speak, to let the film open the door to a different conversation, one not dominated by personal history, but by themes, ideas, and impact. But the audience didn't arrive as a blank slate. They arrived carrying years of context, and context changes how messages land. Imagine standing on stage, feeling that subtle shift, the applause that's slightly delayed, the cheers that don't quite swell, the pockets of sound that don't match the rest of the room. That's when instinct kicks in. You start scanning faces. You read body language. You adjust in real time. That's human, but it's also revealing. Because the moment you start adjusting, you've already lost something, the illusion of ease. Ease is everything in public perception. It signals confidence, control, belonging. Without ease, even neutral moments feel strained. This night was supposed to feel effortless, natural, like a new chapter unfolding organically. Instead, it felt watched. And being watched is different from being welcomed. The festival setting amplified that difference. Sundance doesn't coddle. It observes. It evaluates. It decides quietly And then, sometimes, very loudly. The confidence walking in assumed goodwill, or at least fairness. What it didn't fully account for was mood. Cultural mood matters more than individual intention. And the cultural mood right now is complicated. People are wary of narratives that feel repetitive. They're suspicious of storytelling that appears self-referential. They're quick to question motives, even when the surface message is positive. That skepticism doesn't mean people are cruel. It means they're tired. Tired of being told how to feel. Tired of being guided toward the right takeaway. Tired of narratives that feel prepackaged, no matter how sincere they claim to be. And that fatigue was in the room. You could hear it in the uneven applause. You could feel it in the pauses between reactions. You could sense it in the way attention didn't lock in the way it does when an audience is truly on board. Here's where the tragedy of the night really lies. If the same project had premiered in a different context, with different expectations, it might have been received very differently. If the same people had walked into the room under different circumstances, the energy might have shifted. But timing is ruthless. And this timing demanded humility, not assurance. The confidence that felt appropriate behind the scenes didn't translate cleanly on stage. It read, to some, as tone-deaf, to others, as forced, to still others, as simply misaligned with what they were ready to receive. And misalignment breeds resistance. That resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it snickers. Sometimes it waits until someone makes it audible. That's when the night changed. Because once the first crack appears, everything else becomes fragile. The smiles feel tighter. The jokes feel riskier. The room feels less forgiving. And suddenly, what was meant to be a triumph starts to feel like a test of composure, a test of awareness, a test of whether the story you're telling matches the one the audience believes they've already heard. And tests, unlike celebrations, don't guarantee applause. They demand proof. As the evening moved forward, it became clear this wasn't going to be a smooth glide into validation. Something had shifted beneath the surface. The atmosphere had cooled. The unspoken contract between presenter and audience, the agreement to at least play along, felt thinner. That's when every small moment starts to matter more than it should. A pause, a look, a line delivered a beat too late. Audiences are ruthless in those moments, not because they want to be, but because they're hyper-aware that something is happening they weren't expecting. And when expectations shatter, curiosity spikes. What's going on here? Why does this feel awkward? Is this going to get worse? Those questions ripple through a room faster than applause ever could. And they set the stage for what came next. Because the real turning point didn't happen when the boos were heard. It happened when it became clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message. And the people on stage had to decide in real time how to respond to it. That decision, made in seconds, under lights with no rehearsal, would shape the narrative far beyond that night. And that's where the story truly takes a turn. Because once the audience speaks back, the performance is no longer yours to control. And what happened next would make that painfully clear. What do you do when the room answers back and you don't like the answer? That's the moment we're stepping into now. The precise instant when this stopped being a carefully managed appearance and became something far more volatile. Because once the message from the audience landed, there was no rewind button, no timeout, no quiet regrouping backstage before the next beat, only reaction. And reaction, under lights, tells the truth faster than words ever could. Here's the thing most post-event analysis glosses over. The boos themselves weren't the most dangerous part, not even close. What mattered was what followed immediately after. The half-second of recalibration, the subtle scramble to regain footing, the visible attempt to pretend this wasn't happening. That's when the cameras caught something unscripted. A hesitation. A glance. A moment where confidence flickered into calculation. If you've ever been in front of a crowd that turns on you, even partially, you know that feeling. The blood rushes. Your senses sharpen. Time stretches and compresses all at once. You become hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every face in front of you, and that awareness can either ground you or expose you. This night leaned toward exposure. The body language told the story first. It always does. Shoulders subtly tightening, smiles that held a fraction too long, a posture that shifted from relaxed to defensive. These aren't things people consciously choose. They're automatic responses to perceived threat. And yes, make no mistake, public rejection, even mild, registers as threat, especially when you weren't expecting it. The plan had been simple: acknowledge the crowd, express gratitude, let the project speak for itself. Keep it warm, keep it human, keep it brief. But warmth is hard to project when the room doesn't return it evenly. Suddenly, every word feels heavier. Every sentence carries risk. You remind yourself to slow down, to stay composed, to project calm. But calm, when forced, reads differently than calm when natural. Audiences sense that. They always do. What unfolded next wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. No shouting, no storming off, no overt confrontation. That's precisely why it was so unsettling. The tension lived in the in-between moments, in the pauses that stretched just a little too long, in the applause that arrived late or didn't arrive at all. And then came the heckling. Not loud enough to dominate, not unified enough to dismiss as a fluke, just sharp enough to cut through the atmosphere. This is where things get psychologically interesting. When a crowd hears heckling and the people on stage don't address it directly, a strange feedback loop begins. Some audience members lean in, curious. Others feel secondhand discomfort. A few feel emboldened. Silence becomes charged. Reactions amplify. It's not mob behavior, it's social signaling. People are asking, consciously or not, is this allowed? Is this moment safe to question? Is the authority on stage still intact? And the longer that question hangs unanswered, the more power shifts away from the stage. That shift happened quickly. Attempts were made to carry on as planned, to push forward, to maintain the rhythm of a normal premiere appearance. But the rhythm was gone, replaced by something uneven, unpredictable. You could feel it in the room, and you could see it online almost immediately. Because while this was happening inside the venue, clips were already circulating outside it. Short, contextless snippets. A few seconds here, a reaction shot there, captured by phones, uploaded within minutes. That's the new reality. Moments don't end when the lights go down. They begin when the footage hits the feed. And this footage didn't come with captions written by a PR team. It came with speculation, commentary, side-by-side comparisons, freeze frames, zoom-ins. People started asking questions that hadn't been part of the original conversation. Why does this feel awkward? Why does the crowd sound divided? Why does the reaction on stage look so tense? Those questions spread faster than any official statement could keep up with. And here's the contradiction that made this moment particularly combustible. The project itself was positioned as empathetic, reflective, focused on shared experience, on listening, on connection. But the moment, unfolding in real time, suggested a disconnect, an audience trying to speak and feeling unheard. That contradiction didn't go unnoticed. In fact, it became the subtext of the entire evening. People weren't just reacting to what was being presented. They were reacting to how it was being received and how that reception was being handled. And handling matters. There's an unspoken rule in live appearances. Acknowledge the room you're in, not the one you rehearsed for. That acknowledgement doesn't require capitulation. It requires awareness. The absence of that awareness, or the perception of it, can harden a crowd's skepticism into something sharper. At this point, some supporters in the audience reportedly tried to compensate. Louder applause, encouraging cheers, a kind of counterbalance. But that too can backfire. Because when applause feels performative, it highlights the imbalance instead of smoothing it over. It creates sides, and once sides exist, neutrality disappears. From that moment on, the night wasn't about the documentary anymore. It was about the dynamic between the stage and the seats, about power, perception, and the uncomfortable realization that not everyone was willing to suspend disbelief. What's striking is how quickly the tone shifted in media coverage afterward. Early headlines were cautious, measured. Phrases like mixed reaction and divided crowd appeared. But beneath that careful language, the implication was clear. Something had gone wrong. Not catastrophically, not explosively, but enough to raise eyebrows, enough to warrant discussion, enough to prompt reassessment. And reassessment is dangerous territory for anyone trying to reframe their public image. Because reassessment invites retrospection. People started revisiting old narratives, old interviews, old controversies. Not because they were directly relevant to the film, but because the moment had reopened the door. That's how fragile reputational pivots can be. You can spend months planning a reset, and it can unravel in seconds if the audience doesn't feel aligned with your intent. Behind the scenes, the mood reportedly shifted quickly. What had been expected to feel celebratory became subdued. Conversations grew quieter. Body language closed off. Smiles were polite, but restrained. No one says anything outright in those moments. They don't need to. Everyone feels it. This isn't how tonight was supposed to go. And when a moment fails to meet expectation, the instinct is to contain it, to minimize, to reframe, to wait it out. But containment only works if the story stays inside the room. This one didn't. Because by the time the event wrapped, the narrative was already apparent. This wasn't a triumphant debut. It was a complicated one. A moment that raised more questions than it answered. And that's where the long-term impact begins. Audiences forgive missteps. What they struggle to forgive is perceived tone deafness. A sense that those on stage didn't fully grasp the mood of the moment, or didn't want to. That perception, once formed, is sticky. It colors everything that comes after, which brings us to the most revealing part of the night. Not what was said publicly, but what wasn't said at all. No immediate acknowledgement of the tension, no attempt to address the reaction head-on. No reframing in real time, just a push forward, as if momentum alone could carry the moment through. Sometimes that works. This time, it didn't. Because silence can read as dismissal, and dismissal is the fastest way to alienate an audience already on edge. People don't need you to agree with them, they need you to see them. And the sense that the room felt unseen lingered long after the lights dimmed. That lingering discomfort is what fueled the next wave of conversation. The think pieces, the reaction videos, the slow burn of commentary that follows moments like this. Was this backlash inevitable? Was the venue the wrong choice? Was the project mistimed? Or was this a signal that the public appetite has shifted more dramatically than anyone wanted to admit? Those questions began circulating almost immediately, and unlike boos, they don't fade quickly. They embed themselves into the narrative. This night became a reference point, a before and after marker, not because it was a disaster, but because it was revealing. It showed the limits of narrative control, the risk of assuming goodwill, the danger of walking into a room expecting affirmation when what the room wants is acknowledgement, and perhaps most importantly, it exposed a gap between intention and reception that could no longer be ignored. But the story doesn't end here, because what happened after the audience left, the strategic decisions, the recalibrations, the subtle shifts in messaging, would determine whether this moment became a footnote or a turning point. And that's where the real stakes emerge, because when the applause stops, the questions begin. And the answers, or lack of them, can change everything. What happens when the cameras stop flashing? But the tension doesn't, because that's where this story quietly deepens. Not in the noise outside the venue, not in the clips circulating online, but in the moments after, when the crowd disperses, the lights dim, and the people involved finally have to sit with what just happened. This is the part no one prepares for, the walk back. The exhale that doesn't come, the realization that the night didn't end the way it was supposed to, and that pretending otherwise won't make the feeling go away. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. You could sense it immediately. The kind of shift that doesn't require words. Conversations that were meant to be celebratory turned clipped. Jokes landed flat. People spoke more quietly, more carefully, as if volume alone might draw attention to the discomfort everyone felt. Because everyone felt it. And when everyone feels it, denial becomes impossible. This is where image management collides with emotional reality, where strategy meets instinct, where people who are used to controlling the narrative are forced to confront the fact that tonight, the narrative slipped. What's fascinating is how quickly the human response kicks in before the professional one. The first reactions weren't about press or optics. They were about emotion, confusion, disappointment, a sharp sense of mismatch between expectation and outcome. You don't need to be told something went wrong when your body already knows it. And bodies knew. Posture shifted inward. Energy drained. The adrenaline that normally follows a successful premiere, laughter, relief, celebration, never fully arrived. Instead, there was a low-grade tension, like a hum under the floorboards. Here's a question worth asking yourself. If you had poured months, maybe years, into preparing for a moment meant to signal renewal, and it landed like this, what would your People started talking less about themes and more about tone, less about storytelling and more about reception, less about intention and more about perception. Those shifts matter because perception is sticky. It travels faster than nuance. It survives longer than clarification. And in this case, the perception that began to form was uncomfortable, that the audience had spoken and the people on stage hadn't quite listened. Whether that perception was fair is almost beside the point. Once it exists, it shapes the conversation. What's particularly striking is how this moment reignited older debates. Conversations that had cooled began warming up again. People revisited previous controversies not because they were directly related, but because the moment had reopened emotional files. That's how public memory works. It's associative. One moment triggers another. One reaction reactivates a dormant narrative. And suddenly, you're not just dealing with a premiere, you're dealing with history. History is heavy. It bends moments around it. It changes how people interpret silence, smiles, even gratitude. This is where the story gets more complicated and more revealing. Because the choices made after this moment weren't about correcting a mistake, they were about deciding what story to tell next. Do you acknowledge the discomfort and risk amplifying it? Do you ignore it and hope it fades? Do you pivot to something else entirely? Each option carries risk. Acknowledgement invites scrutiny. Silence invites speculation. Pivoting invites suspicion. There is no perfect move here, only trade-offs. And trade-offs reveal priorities. What mattered most in the aftermath wasn't saving face. It was preserving trajectory, ensuring that this moment didn't define everything that followed. But trajectories are shaped not just by action, but by trust. And trust, once shaken, demands repair. That repair doesn't happen through strategy alone. It requires resonance, alignment, a sense that the audience is being engaged, not managed. That's where things start to get uncomfortable for anyone used to controlling their image. Because control is the opposite of connection. And connection is what Sundance audiences value most. This brings us to the uncomfortable realization at the core of this chapter. The problem wasn't that the audience reacted. The problem was that the reaction revealed a gap between how the project was framed and how it was received, between how the people on stage saw themselves and how some in the room saw them, between intention and impact. Gaps can be closed, but only if they're acknowledged. Ignoring them allows them to widen. And as the days passed, it became clear that this gap wasn't closing on its own. If anything, it was becoming more visible. Clips kept circulating. Commentary grew more confident. The tone of discussion hardened slightly, not into outrage, but into skepticism. Skepticism is the most dangerous audience emotion of all, because skeptical audiences don't shout. They watch, they wait, they remember, and they decide slowly, which leads us to the next critical phase of this story. Because while public reaction simmered, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes, something that would shape how this moment was ultimately interpreted. A shift in strategy, a reassessment of tone, a recognition that this wasn't just about one night, it was about what came next. And the decisions made in that quiet window would determine whether this appearance became a footnote or a symbol, because once a moment is framed as symbolic, it stops belonging to the people who lived it. It belongs to everyone watching, and that's when control really slips away. What if the most important conversation didn't happen on stage, but in a quiet room afterward, where no one was recording? Because that's where moments like this are truly decided. Not under the lights, not in front of the crowd, but in the aftermath, when adrenaline fades and reality settles in. This is the chapter where strategy replaces instinct. And instinct, on this night, had already spoken. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted again. This wasn't panic, it wasn't chaos, it was something more controlled, and in some ways more unsettling. A collective acknowledgement that the night hadn't gone according to plan, paired with the sober realization that pretending otherwise wouldn't make the footage disappear. There's a phrase people in media circles use quietly: you can't outrun a moment. This was one of those moments. The first order of business wasn't damage control, it was diagnosis. What exactly went wrong? Was it the crowd composition? Was it the timing? Was it the framing of the project? Or was the reaction less about the film itself and more about who was presenting it? That last question hung in the air longer than the others, because it's the hardest one to answer honestly. It forces you to confront something uncomfortable, that the audience's response might not be fixable with better messaging alone, that the issue might be relational, not rhetorical, emotional, not informational. And emotional gaps are notoriously resistant to spin. Inside those conversations, there was reportedly a sense of disbelief, not outrage, but surprise. The kind that comes from assuming goodwill and discovering it isn't evenly distributed. That assumption is common among public figures who've spent years in controlled environments. Environments where reactions are managed, audiences are filtered, and dissent rarely makes it into the room. Sundance is different. It doesn't filter for comfort, it filters for interest. And interest doesn't always equal admiration. This is where the tension between celebrity culture and creative culture becomes impossible to ignore. In celebrity spaces, presence alone carries value. In creative spaces, presence is irrelevant without resonance. That distinction matters, because the expectation walking into this festival was that the project would be evaluated on its merits, separate from the presenter's past. But audiences don't compartmentalize that cleanly, especially not when the presenters themselves are part of the story. That's the contradiction at the heart of this entire episode. You can't ask people to separate the art from the artist when the artist has made their identity inseparable from the narrative. And that contradiction became painfully clear in the hours after the premiere. The internal debate reportedly wasn't about whether the reaction was fair. It was about how to respond to it without making things worse. Responding too quickly risks amplifying the moment. Responding too defensively risks confirming the criticism. Not responding at all risks letting others define the story. There's no winning move, only less damaging ones. And here's where things get particularly revealing. The silence that followed wasn't just strategic. It was reflective, a pause not only to assess public reaction, but to reassess assumptions. Assumptions about audience appetite, assumptions about cultural mood, assumptions about how much goodwill still existed in neutral spaces. Those assumptions had guided the entire rollout, and now they were being questioned. One quiet realization reportedly began to crystallize. This wasn't a hostile crowd problem. It was a relevance problem. Not relevance in the sense of fame. That wasn't in question. Relevance in the sense of emotional alignment. Did this story, told this way, by these people, meet the audience where they were? Or was it asking the audience to meet it somewhere else entirely? That's a brutal question for any creator. Because if the answer is the latter, the problem isn't execution, it's premise. And premises are harder to fix than messaging. Meanwhile, outside those rooms, the public conversation was maturing. Early reactions hardened into narratives, not dramatic ones, not scandal-driven ones, but analytical ones. People weren't outraged, they were dissecting. Dissection is dangerous. It strips away myth. It challenges framing. It exposes inconsistencies. And inconsistencies are what critics feast on. Some commentators began framing the moment as symbolic, not catastrophic, but indicative, a sign that something about the ongoing public storytelling wasn't landing the way it once did. That framing stuck because it felt plausible, and plausibility is all a narrative needs to survive. Once a story feels plausible, people repeat it, they build on it, they look for evidence to support it. That's when the feedback loop begins. And this is where timing becomes critical, because timing determines whether a moment fades or calcifies. If something else captures attention quickly, the moment recedes. If not, it becomes a reference point. In this case, the absence of an immediate reframing allowed the moment to breathe, to expand, to settle into public memory. The irony is that the silence meant to reduce impact may have increased it, because people filled the gap. They always do. And what they filled it with wasn't outrage. It was interpretation. Interpretation about fatigue, about repetition, about a perceived disconnect between message and messenger. Those interpretations didn't come from nowhere. They drew on years of accumulated public perception, years of coverage, commentary, and polarized debate. This appearance didn't create those perceptions. It activated them. That's a crucial distinction. Moments like this don't introduce new narratives, they validate existing ones. And once validation occurs, the conversation shifts from, is this happening, to, what does this mean? Meaning is harder to control than facts. You can correct a fact, you can dispute a claim, but meaning lives in feeling. And feelings don't respond to press releases. Inside the strategy discussions, the question became less about what went wrong and more about what comes next. Do you lean into creative spaces again, or pull back? Do you recalibrate tone, or stay the course? Do you acknowledge the tension, or let time smooth it over? Each option carried implications beyond this project, because this wasn't just about a documentary. It was about positioning, about future opportunities, about whether creative credibility could still be established in spaces that prize authenticity over status. That credibility is fragile. It doesn't come from intent. It comes from reception. And reception on this night was fractured. What made the situation more complex was the absence of a clear villain. No single heckler to point to, no organized protest, no obvious trigger, just a room responding honestly and unpredictably. That kind of reaction is the hardest to challenge because it doesn't announce itself as opposition. It presents itself as feedback, and feedback demands listening, which brings us to the pivotal tension at the heart of this chapter. Listening requires humility, and humility is difficult when you believe your message is important. That doesn't mean the message isn't important. It means importance alone doesn't guarantee acceptance. Audiences don't owe anyone openness. They offer it conditionally. That condition, in this case, may not have been met. As the days passed, one thing became increasingly clear. This appearance would not be remembered for what was said on stage, but for what it revealed about the relationship between the presenters and the audience. A relationship strained, uncertain, and suddenly under scrutiny again. That scrutiny didn't erupt into scandal, but it didn't fade either. It lingered. And lingering scrutiny is what leads to recalibration. Because when you realize that even neutral spaces are no longer guaranteed to be friendly, you start asking harder questions about your approach. Questions that don't have easy answers. Questions that force you to confront not just how you're perceived, but why. Those questions would soon shape the next moves, the next appearances, the next attempts at narrative control. And they would raise an even more unsettling possibility. What if this wasn't a temporary setback? What if it was a signal that the cultural mood had shifted more decisively than anyone anticipated? Because if that's true, then this night wasn't just awkward, it was instructive. And ignoring instruction rarely ends well. The next phase of this story would hinge on whether that instruction was understood or dismissed. Because the public doesn't repeat lessons forever. Eventually, it moves on. But when it doesn't, that's when moments become markers. And this one was dangerously close. What if the signal wasn't subtle at all, but everyone just hoped it was? That's the uncomfortable possibility hanging over this chapter. Because by now, the idea that this was merely an unlucky night had started to wear thin. Too many pieces lined up. Too many reactions echoed one another. Too many observers, supportive and critical alike, kept circling the same conclusion without coordinating it. Something had shifted. And once a shift is felt, it doesn't matter how carefully you explain it away. The ground has already moved. In the days that followed, conversations inside the inner circle reportedly grew more introspective. Less about optics, more about fundamentals. Less about headlines, more about trajectory. This is the point where long-term strategies either evolve or harden into denial. There's a quiet fork in the road after moments like this. One path leads toward recalibration. The other leads toward repetition. Both feel defensible at first. Both can be justified internally. Only one works. Repetition is comforting. It says, stay the course, trust the plan, the audience will come around. Recalibration is unsettling. It says, something about this isn't landing, and we need to understand why. Recalibration requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is risky when you're already under scrutiny. But the alternative, doubling down, comes with its own risk, confirming the very critiques you're hoping will fade. This is where contradiction becomes unavoidable. The public-facing message had long emphasized listening, empathy, and shared experience. Yet the moment demanded those qualities in reverse. It demanded listening to the audience, empathy for their reaction, and acknowledgement of shared fatigue. That reversal is hard for anyone in the spotlight because it asks you to momentarily stop telling your story and start absorbing someone else's. Absorption doesn't generate headlines. It doesn't trend. It doesn't feel productive, but it's often the only way forward. One of the more striking aspects of the post-event conversation was how few people were truly celebrating the reaction. Even critics didn't sound triumphant. They sounded resigned, as if they'd seen this coming. As if the moment simply confirmed what they'd suspected for a while. That tone matters. Triumphant backlash burns fast and fades fast. Resigned backlash lingers. It suggests inevitability. And inevitability is devastating for any attempt at reinvention. The word that kept surfacing in commentary, sometimes explicitly, sometimes between the lines, was fatigue. Not anger, not hatred, fatigue. Fatigue is the quiet killer of public narratives. It doesn't shout, it sighs. It says, we've heard this before, even when the details are different. It says, we're being asked to care in a way that feels familiar, not fresh. It says, convince us again, and do it better this time. Convincing a tired audience is infinitely harder than convincing a skeptical one. Skepticism can be overcome with evidence. Fatigue requires novelty, and novelty is hard when your story is inseparable from your identity. This is the paradox at the center of this entire saga. The project was meant to demonstrate evolution, growth, a new creative direction. But to many in the audience, it still felt like a continuation, another chapter in a long-running narrative they hadn't opted into. That perception may not be fair, but fairness isn't the currency here. Attention is. And attention is finite. When attention thins, reactions sharpen, not because people care more, but because they care less. That's why the booing, though limited, carried so much weight. It wasn't just rejection. It was interruption, a disruption of the expected flow, a refusal to participate passively. Passive audiences are easy. Engaged audiences are demanding. Disengaging audiences are the most dangerous of all. They don't attack, they withdraw. This moment suggested withdrawal had begun. Not total withdrawal, not abandonment, but the early stages of disengagement, the kind where people stop granting the benefit of the doubt. And once that happens, every misstep feels heavier. Every pause feels intentional. Every silence feels strategic. The post-premiere silence, in that context, was interpreted through a harsher lens. Not as restraint, but as avoidance. Not as reflection, but as reluctance to engage. Again, perception doesn't need to be accurate to be influential. It just needs to feel coherent. And coherence was building. What's striking is how quickly the focus shifted from the crowd to the creators, from who booed to why the reaction felt inevitable, from isolated behavior to broader patterns. Patterns are sticky. They invite retrospection. People started connecting dots backward. Past interviews, past projects, past public moments. Not maliciously, but methodically. This is how narratives solidify. They don't explode into being, they accrete, layer by layer. Each moment adding weight. The Sundance appearance became one of those layers. Not the heaviest one, but an important one, a data point, evidence. And evidence, once gathered, is rarely discarded. Behind the scenes, the realization that this moment would be referenced again and again started to settle in, that it wouldn't disappear into the churn of news cycles as easily as hoped, because it wasn't outrageous enough to be dismissed as a fluke, and it wasn't smooth enough to be forgotten. It lived in the uncomfortable middle. That's where moments survive. This raised an even more unsettling question. What if the problem wasn't messaging or timing, but saturation? Saturation is brutal. It doesn't mean people hate you, it means they feel full. And when people feel full, offering them more of the same, even in a different package, feels intrusive. This is where creative reinvention usually demands a genuine rupture. A break so clear that audiences can't map it onto what came before. The problem is, ruptures are risky. They require letting go of familiar frameworks. They require silence that isn't strategic, but substantive. They require stepping back far enough that people miss you before you return. That's difficult in an ecosystem that rewards constant visibility. Visibility keeps you relevant, but it also keeps you exposed. This moment forced a confrontation with that trade-off. Is constant presence still an asset, or has it become a liability? The Sundance reaction didn't answer that question definitively, but it made it impossible to ignore, because it demonstrated that even spaces presumed to be receptive were no longer predictable. And unpredictability is kryptonite to long-term narrative planning. When you can't anticipate reception, you can't manage momentum. And when momentum stalls, confidence erodes, not just publicly, but internally. That erosion was subtle, but real. The language reportedly shifted in internal discussions. Less certainty, more qualifiers, more if and maybe. Those words signal reassessment. Reassessment is healthy, but it's also destabilizing. It means previous assumptions no longer hold. And when assumptions collapse, strategy must be rebuilt. Rebuilding takes time. Time that public attention does not pause to grant. While recalibration was underway, the public conversation continued evolving without guidance. Reaction videos layered interpretation on top of interpretation. Commentary became more assured. Less speculative, people spoke as if the meaning of the moment was already settled. That's how control slips away. Not through confrontation, through consensus. Once enough people agree on what a moment meant, that meaning becomes sticky, even if it's incomplete. And incomplete meanings are often the hardest to undo. What's more, this moment subtly altered expectations for future appearances. People would now watch with a different lens, listening for tension, watching for cracks, expecting discomfort. Expectations shape outcomes. If an audience expects awkwardness, it's more likely to perceive it, even when it isn't there. That's the long tail of moments like this. They haunt, they preload interpretation. They turn neutral events into tests, and tests are exhausting for everyone involved. Which leads us to the next uncomfortable truth. Once a public figure becomes a test case, they stop being evaluated on their work alone. They're evaluated on what they represent. In this case, the representation had become complicated, not villainous, not heroic, just heavy. Heavy with context, heavy with expectation, heavy with unresolved conversation. That weight showed up in the room that night, and it followed everyone out. This is where the story pivots again, because the question is no longer what went wrong at Sundance. The question is what that moment unlocked, what conversations it reopened, what strategies it forced into question, and what it revealed about the current relationship between storyteller and audience. That relationship is the real story here, and it's one that doesn't reset easily. The next phase would depend on whether that relationship could be renegotiated, or whether it had already calcified into something far less flexible. Because once audiences decide how they feel, changing their minds requires more than intention. It requires absence, humility, and something genuinely new. Whether that was possible remained an open question. And the answer would determine whether this night faded into context or hardened into legacy. What if the problem wasn't that the audience misunderstood, but that they understood perfectly over everything that followed? Because once you strip away the noise, the speculation, the defensive reactions, and the loyal counterarguments, you're left with something harder to dismiss, the possibility that the reaction wasn't confusion at all. It was clarity. Clarity can be more destabilizing than outrage. Outrage burns hot and fast. Clarity settles in and rearranges how people see you. And that's what made this phase of the fallout so unsettling. In the weeks after the appearance, a subtle but noticeable shift occurred in how the moment was discussed. The tone moved away from shock and toward interpretation, away from "did you see what happened?" and toward "what does this tell us?" That's a dangerous transition, because once a moment becomes explanatory rather than sensational, it stops being temporary. It becomes a lens. People began treating the Sundance reaction not as an isolated event, but as evidence within a longer argument. An argument about public storytelling, about credibility, about whether certain narratives still resonate the way they once did. And here's where things get deeply uncomfortable for anyone invested in control. The crowd's response wasn't framed as cruelty. It was framed as feedback. That framing matters. Cruelty can be condemned. Feedback demands response. But responding to feedback means accepting the premise that something didn't land. And that acceptance didn't come publicly. Instead, what followed was a careful continuation of existing posture. No dramatic pivot, no visible rupture. Just forward motion, measured, deliberate, and notably unchanged. To supporters, that consistency read as resilience. To critics, it read as denial. To everyone else, the vast middle, it read as something else entirely. Inflexibility. And inflexibility is rarely admired in creative spaces. Creative audiences prize risk, self-awareness, and growth, not perfection, but evolution. They forgive missteps when they sense learning. They become impatient when they sense repetition. That impatience is what began to surface more clearly after Sundance, not in angry op-eds, not in viral takedowns, but in tone. Tone is the first thing to change when audiences disengage. It becomes flatter, less curious, more dismissive. People stop asking what will they do next and start saying, of course this happened. Of course is the most dangerous phrase in public life. It implies predictability. And predictability is the enemy of fascination. One commentator summed it up quietly but brutally. This wasn't a scandal. It was a shrug. Shrugs don't trend, but they kill momentum, because momentum depends on surprise. And surprise had been replaced by expectation. That's when the deeper question emerged. Had the narrative arc become too familiar to sustain reinvention? This isn't about fairness or intent or effort. It's about saturation. Audiences don't measure effort. They measure feeling. And the feeling many people expressed, often reluctantly, was weariness, not hostility. Weariness. They weren't saying stop. They were saying convince me again. But convincing requires novelty, and novelty requires distance from what came before. That distance hadn't yet materialized. The Sundance moment forced that realization into sharper focus, because it showed that even when the setting changed, even when the tone softened, even when the framing emphasized creativity over controversy, the reaction remained mixed, which suggests the issue wasn't surface level. It was structural. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. The storytelling emphasized moving forward, yet the public conversation kept circling backward. The message focused on new chapters, but the audience kept referencing old ones. That gap created friction, and friction generates heat, but not light. What's particularly revealing is how supporters and critics began to sound more alike than different. In one key respect, both acknowledged that something felt stuck. Supporters framed it as unfair scrutiny. Critics framed it as earned fatigue. Different conclusions, same observation. Stagnation. Stagnation doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means movement without progress. And that's often worse than stalling completely, because it exhausts everyone involved. Behind the scenes, this forced an even more difficult conversation. Not how do we fix the optics, but do we need to change the approach? Changing approach is risky. It invites vulnerability. It admits that previous strategies didn't work as intended. But refusing to change invites irrelevance. And irrelevance is the one thing visibility can't protect you from. The irony is that the project itself aimed to assert relevance, cultural, emotional, creative relevance. But the reaction suggested a mismatch between that assertion and how it was received. Assertions don't create relevance. Resonance does. Resonance happens when audiences feel seen, not instructed. And that's where the Sundance reaction struck its deepest nerve. Some audience members reportedly described feeling talked at rather than talked with. Not attacked, but directed. Not dismissed, but managed. That perception, once formed, is difficult to reverse, because it reframes every subsequent interaction. Statements become scripts. Silence becomes strategy. Even authenticity becomes suspect. This is the trap of prolonged public storytelling. The more you explain yourself, the less believable explanations become. Audiences crave moments that feel unplanned, unpolished, slightly out of control. Ironically, the Sundance appearance was unplanned in one crucial way. The audience reaction, but that unplanned element wasn't embraced. It was endured. Endurance reads differently than engagement. Engagement says, I hear you. Endurance says, I'll wait you out. Which one do you think audiences respond to more warmly? That question lingered long after the event, and it influenced how future moves were anticipated. People began predicting awkwardness before it happened, anticipating tension before it appeared, interpreting neutral moments through the memory of Sundance. That's how moments echo. They don't need to be repeated to be felt again. They become reference points. Shortcuts, signals. And Sundance became a signal, not of failure, but of fragility. Fragility in narrative control, fragility in audience patience, fragility in the assumption that intention guarantees acceptance. That fragility isn't fatal, but it demands response. The absence of a clear response allowed the moment to settle into public consciousness as unresolved. Unresolved moments don't fade, they hover. They resurface, they get cited, and each citation strips them of context while amplifying their meaning. This is where the long tail begins. The part of the story that unfolds not in headlines, but in expectations. Future appearances would now carry an invisible question mark. Will this land? Will this be awkward? Will the crowd respond? Those questions shift the energy before anything even happens. And energy, as anyone who's been on stage knows, is half the battle. If you walk into a room already braced for resistance, you project caution. If you project caution, audiences sense it. If audiences sense it, they mirror it. And